Hey everybody. So I think my basic agenda for doing these videos, since you people do apparently crave them, I don't know what's wrong with you, frankly, but I'm going to give the people what they want. And this is basically what I did at the Young Turks. I wouldn't just go and rant about any given topic on video, right? I would want to be a little more measured and a little more calculated, frankly, than just go and say whatever on the top of my mind. So what I do is at the Young Turks was I tethered my video ranty talk at the camera type things to stuff that I had written. So if I wrote an article for the Young Turks or the CNBC contributorship that I had for a while at the Young Turks, what I would do is I would basically elaborate on that article and link to it in the description box of the video so people could go read it. And that's basically what I'm going to do from now on here in this channel. I mean, there might be some exceptions now and then, but the intention is to do it in accordance with things that I have written, so my thoughts are formulated, so that the evidence that I'm proffering has already been laid out. You can go evaluate it for yourself. And I think that's different from your standard YouTuber. You know, not to be pejorative, but a lot of people on here just go and willy-nilly just spout off on whatever it is they're thinking about on a given day, and that's just not my approach generally. Because I tend to be a little, and I'm not trying to be pompous, but I tend to be at least attempt to be grounded in journalistic fidelity to facts and argumentation and evidence and that kind of thing. So anyway, that out of the way, I actually had a piece published today for tomorrow, actually India time. So I had a piece published in this newspaper called the New Indian Express, which is a major newspaper based in Chennai, India. It's in South India. They had asked me to write a column before a couple months ago on Tulsi Gabbard, actually, and I did, and it was very good. So they asked me recently to contribute another column, and I was happy to oblige, basically on the media's failures with regard to this Trump-Russia debacle. And although I'm very happy to contribute to a major newspaper in India, and it's actually an honor in a way, I do have to note how conspicuous it is that it's fallen to foreign media. So India, I've written other stuff for The Spectator, which is a UK magazine. It's fallen to foreign media in the main, it would seem, to really examine the massive, massive failures and corruption and all kinds of malfeasance that gave rise to this Trump-Russia debacle, which the U.S. media largely refuses to reckon with, in part because they're all complicit in it for the most part. And there's a handful of people who are not complicit, so of course they're not going to be willing to undertake a really painful self-assessment that would be required to actually get to the bottom of how something so spectacularly catastrophic could have come about. And I'm sure now with the Mueller report, the full Mueller report coming out sometime in the next couple of days, they're going to latch on to all kinds of other excuses about how, oh, we weren't actually wrong. Look at this kind of ancillary detail that Mueller came up with. Look at this, little piece of venality that Trump or Trump associates exhibited that Mueller found. Oh my God, that justifies our 3 years of hysteria and conspiratorial rumor mongering and innuendo. No, of course not. It was never justified. It was always a conspiracy hoax. And I use the word hoax deliberately, and I know that that's the word preferred by people like Trump and his partisan GOP acolytes, but it really was a hoax, and you could tell it from the very beginning. So anyway, I mean, the fact that I'm having, and I'm not saying people have to come to me specifically, although I am somebody who has been covering all this in a journalistic capacity since the very beginning. So, but the fact that it's Indian publications and British publications and non-American publications who are coming to me and saying, "Hey, give us your take on how this epic media failure came about," it doesn't bode well for the people who are complicit in the failure in the United States actually coming to terms with what they did And what they did was horrendous on a monumental scale. I mean, I hope all of you have read the Matt Taibbi Substack piece from a couple weeks ago now. Just as the Barr letter came out announcing no collusion. I mean, that only scratches the surface, really. There's so much more, and I'm going to be covering all of it in depth, in long form. So get ready, because the audit has only just begun, and it's not going to be pretty. But anyway, the angle that I took in this one column, and you only have limited space in one column, so I chose one particular angle, was how you can trace the structural causes of the Trump-Russia debacle to an earlier debacle, which is analogous, meaning Iraq WMD. Now, of course, Iraq WMD was different in so many respects. We're only analogizing it here in terms of the scale of the media error, so not the scale of the human death toll, inflicted, or the carnage, or the financial waste. None of that. Well, purely are we analogizing this on the grounds of the media failure entailed. That's what the point Taibbi makes in his piece. And I agree. He actually says that the Trump-Russia debacle is far worse than Iraq WMD in the sense of the media failure that was involved. Now think about that. That's crazy. But he's right. And you want to know why? And because at least during Iraq WMD, a lot of mainstream liberal organs and, establishment Democrat-aligned institutions went along with the Bush misadventure, gave it, bipartisan credibility, which was politically necessary in a way for Bush to be able to launch the war. If it was seen as a purely partisan endeavor, probably never would have gotten away with it. So everybody from Hillary Clinton to Joe Biden famously voted in favor of the war. But at the same time, you did have progressive media, right? So, Mother Jones, The Nation, the Young Turks, although it was in its infancy then. Other media entities that were broadly under the umbrella of progressivism in the U.S., pretty much skeptical of the Iraq invasion gambit from the beginning. The blogosphere, in its earliest incarnations, came about in large part because of disaffection with how the predominant media, the prevailing media narratives, were treating this Iraq issue. They wanted to create a counter narrative using their own, journalistic model and analytical approach to push back on the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, and so forth in their Iraq war advocacy. Whether it was overt or, behind the cloak of journalistic objectivity, which is always phony. But in Trump-Russia, you had progressive organs in the main. Now, not exclusively. There are a handful of exceptions to the point where those that were exceptions have become this skeptics caucus, right? Which is kind of like my semi-ironic, descriptor for it. But you had everybody from Mother Jones, to Democracy Now!, to the Young Turks, to name your favorite progressive outfit. One exception is The Nation, and I've lauded them for that. They did give a space to skeptics. So The Nation actually carried forth its long-standing charge to be a skeptic of militarism, of corporate media conformity. They actually did their duty. So I commend them for that. And having started journalistically at The Nation, long time ago now, 8 years or so. I'm actually very gratified at that. So and I've expressed that to Katrina directly. So um, anyway, the point is that there is, in the case of Iraq WMD, at least there was some space in the media for countervailing narratives, right? Whereas in the case of Trump Russia, it was so suffocating. I mean, all you had in terms of an alternative available, generally speaking, was conservative media. And even not even all of conservative media was skeptical. Only the kind of like more ardently pro-Trump elements of conservative media, which at this point does constitute the majority of conservative media, but still, I mean, it wasn't as if it was a total uniformity. But anyway, so that I think justifies Taibbi's assertion that this was worse. Trump Russia was worse than Iraq WMD in that specific regard. And in other regards too, and again, this story is so sprawling and all encompassing that it almost is overwhelming to know how to even begin to approach it in a comprehensive way, right? But that's up to us to be able to figure out how to do, and that's why I feel obliged to do that, and I will be doing it. So don't you worry. But anyway, back to the column. The reason why I invoked the Iraq analogy in this column was because you can look from a structural perspective at the failures that attended to Iraq WMD and see a precedent, a structural precedent that would later give rise to the media failures that attended to Trump Russia. And I use three examples, three specific figures in the media, in the elite media, as the basis for that hypothesis. So one is this gentleman named Jonathan Chait. I don't know if you all are aware of this fella, but I don't know, maybe Google him and apprise yourself if you are sadly unfamiliar, because, wow, you're missing out. Chait first came to be known on the national scene with a lot of prominence when he wrote a cover story in the New Republic in October of 2002, which made the case for why liberals should support the Iraq War, should support George W. Bush's march to invasion. That was the big reason why anybody really learned of who Jonathan Chait was. The New Republic at that point was still very influential, or most people were not reading online media at that point, 2002, or at least people in positions of influence and power were still, in large part, reading physical magazines, you know. And the New Republic, it was a defining opinion maker for a long stretch of time there, from, you know, roughly the 80s to the early 2000s. You know, it was famously the in-flight magazine for Bill Clinton when he was president on Air Force One. That was the popular conception. And I have written for the New Republic. It has some good stuff for sure over the years. So I'm not discounting it on the whole. And they have changed editorial leadership many times over since this period in 2002. This was the dark Marty Peretz period. And I'm sorry if I'm getting too into the weeds of this media, you know, stuff here. But some people hopefully will know what I'm talking about. Anyway, here's what Chait proclaimed in his October 2002 cover story. He chastised liberals as, quote, being blinded by their hatred of George W. Bush and failing to recognize, quote, that America's prospective war with Iraq isn't merely defensible. It's defensible on explicitly liberal grounds. Wow. So there's Chait in all his glory, stating for the record, for future historians to look back on, giving his liberal imprimatur to the virtuousness and the moral rightness of the preemptive invasion of Iraq, spearheaded by Dick Cheney and George. So that's Chait. And, years later, Chait would admit that, he made mistakes and he would do these kind of tedious, looking back on, my errors, takes in the various places he'd written for, principally New Republic, later New York Magazine. But as we'll later discover, didn't seem to make a whole lot of lasting impact in terms of Chait's analytical approach. So Chait was never held accountable for his grievous failings with regard to the Iraq advocacy. And sure enough, major politicians, like I mentioned, Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, they would invoke rationale that was similar to what Chait outlined when they were justifying their votes in favor of the war. But nevertheless, Chait did over the years say, oh, maybe I shouldn't have jumped on board the Bush-Cheney train for a preemptive invasion of a sovereign country. Oops. But sure enough, Chait became a huge Russiagate proponent. Curious. It always seems like there's a lot of overlap between these categories. A lot of neoconservative / liberal synergy there. Remember in 2016, when a lot of the big neocons flocked to the Hillary Clinton campaign because they were so aghast by Trump? Turns out they were wrong to be so aghast because elements of neocons have ended up infiltrating Trump anyway. So it's not as if they didn't have two relatively decent options available to them, but nevertheless, they all had a freak out and said, oh yeah, we got to line up behind Hillary Clinton because she's our only hope. So like Max Boot, Bill Kristol, these people. Even Paul Wolfowitz, who was like the brain genius in terms of the theory behind the Bush administration's rationale for attacking Iraq. But anyway, there's a lot of synergy there. Synergy, using that, corporate term that you read in a lot of pamphlets and such. But Chait kept on trucking. And he trucked long and hard to the point where in July of 2018, he published yet another cover story, this time in New York Magazine, where he asserted, and I'm not making this up, please go look it up. Please don't trust me. Please Google it. He asserted that Trump not only had colluded with Russia, he had been colluding with Russia since 1987. That is what Jonathan Chait postulated in this cover story in one of the premier magazines in the United States that people read while they're sitting in dentist offices, while they're waiting to get, their colonoscopy or whatever, in the waiting room at Dr. So-and-so's on the Upper West Side. This is what people are flipping through, or they're glancing at. So when people tell me that this Trump-Russia conspiracy stuff was totally outside the mainstream or wasn't embraced by every sector of elite society, I say, what are you talking about? No, what's wrong? Just this past Friday, Seth Abramson, yes, I'm pronouncing that right, Seth Abramson, who is one of the most notoriously crazy Trump-Russia conspiracy Twitter wackos, where he has like 700 tweet threads where he gets into every little piece of evidence that you missed, but he had found, and he wants to provide it to you and give you all the context and blah, blah, blah. He was on Bill Maher. And not just on Bill Maher was thanking him for what a great public service he was providing. Um, Bill Maher said that he's a big fan of Seth Abramson's Twitter threads. I promise I'm not making this up. Please go look it up for yourself. Don't trust me on any of this. Um, so this all came from the corridors of elite respectability. They were the progenitors of the conspiracy theory. It didn't emanate from the fringes. Fringe elements picked up on it, but it started in the FBI, the CIA, and the establishment media. New York Times, Washington Post, Atlantic, Daily Beast. And because Chait was never held accountable for his massive failings with regard to Iraq WMD, it should have gone without saying that, of course, he would pick up on another mammoth conspiracy, fairy tale years later. And I mentioned the Atlantic. Here's another example I mentioned in the column. Again, read the column. Just read it. It won't take you long. Jeffrey Goldberg is another prime offender here who just makes my blood boil. Also in 2002, Jeffrey Goldberg, then in the New Yorker, and you can't get any higher than that on the journalistic pyramid in terms of the prestige that is conferred upon you. Jeffrey Goldberg wrote a piece in 2002, The New Yorker, much touted, charging that Saddam Hussein was in league with Al Qaeda. Remember that? I remember that. I was a teen when all that was going on, but I still remember that was very much in the ether of American cultural and political life, right? Jeffrey Goldberg was one of the prime progenitors of that conspiracy theory. That Saddam Hussein was somehow behind 9/11 and with Al Qaeda. Dick Cheney himself went around heralding Goldberg's story in the New York because it was so valuable for their making of the case to invade Iraq. But Goldberg never recanted his debunked take, never apologized. And what happened? Well, he ascended through the ranks of journalistic respectability and prestige. He gained even more power and influence in the industry because the industry is fundamentally broken. The incentives that are operative within the industry are in shambles. They make no logical sense. The worst people are the ones who get rewarded and the ones who ascend up the ladder. So Jeffrey Goldberg became the editor-in-chief of what? The Atlantic, later on. And the Atlantic is another big elite magazine that people are very impressed when they see your byline in. I've not written for the Atlantic, but it's okay. Don't need to. The Atlantic is now funded by Laurene Powell Jobs, so the widow of Steve Jobs. So they have huge financial backing. And what did Jeffrey Goldberg do in regard to the Trump-Russia fiasco? Well, you guessed it. He was one of the first people to label Trump in July of 2016, quote, an agent of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Right in that key time period, July 2016, when the narrative was congealing and when the security state apparatus was seemingly reacting to public news events that was being filtered to them from the media to initiate their investigations, Jeffrey Goldberg was right there, giving all this kind of order and kind of making all these suspicions and hunches into this coherent narrative that he was promulgating from the pages of the venerable Atlantic. And why was he in a position to do this? Because nobody held him accountable for his grave failings in 2002, just like Chait. But it doesn't end there for Jeffrey. Not only did he personally continue the failures, he hired, in his capacity of editor-in-chief of the Atlantic, some of the worst offenders from the George W. Bush period, arguably among the most offensive actors from that era, namely David Frum. And I'm assuming most of you know who David Frum is. If not, please just Google it. Don't make me recount all of David Frum's past misdeeds, because it'd just be too distressing. I'll give you a little bit. The guy who helped coin the axis of evil phrase that Bush infamously gave in his State of the Union address, 2002, where he said we're going to go after Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. And sure enough, he went to war with one of them in within just a little over a year, and almost went to war with another. North Korea is a different story, but things didn't go particularly well there either during the Bush years. And a lot of that you can attribute to, at least rhetorically, David Frum. And David Frum seamlessly from there transitioned into journalism. So he's a senior editor now at The Atlantic. Also, ardent Russian-gator, collusion truther. Shocking. And Jeffrey Goldberg also hired people like Natasha Bertrand. I don't know if you've seen her. She's like also somebody whose stuff has just been totally debunked with regard to Russiagate. She was like an alarmist with regard to these like DMs that Roger Stone sent, to which WikiLeaks was supposed to be indication that there was some massive conspiracy. When it turns out Roger Stone never had any privileged access whatsoever to WikiLeaks publications and was just BSing. So there you go. There's Jeffrey Goldberg for you. That's his massively valuable contributions to the American journalistic scene. These three guys, and these are just three of the worst offenders. By the way, Jonathan Chait, when he published that piece, who had him on to discuss it in very solemn, serious tones? Chris Hayes had Jonathan on MSNBC to discuss the theory that Trump had been colluding with Russia since 1987. They were taking that extraordinarily seriously. Again, please go look it up. Don't take my word for it. These are just three of the worst examples. I could go on and on and on. And there's some younger journalists and stuff who, weren't around so much, 203, who wouldn't fit into this kind of criteria I'm constructing, but it just goes to show, in general, that when you hold or you fail to hold wrongdoers accountable for their grievous misdeeds, they're obviously going to commit more misdeeds, probably even on a more epic scale. And that's what these three individuals were permitted to do by virtue of the totally corrupted and perverted incentive structure upon which the American journalistic industry operates. It's a sham, it's a disgrace, it's a complete joke. And sorry to have to give you the bad news. But it's true. And I'll leave it for now. Again, please read the article. I will link to it. And have a great night, everybody. Bye-bye.